and on the essential workers that make up many of our immigrant communities in New York City and who have helped kept the city running during this past year and always, of course. But we are also going to look at the path forward after COVID and what long-term recovery looks like. We are joined by Ligia Gualpa of the Workers' Justice Project, Somia Al-Rumaim of the Union of Arab Women, Mahtab Khan and Hanadi Dole of the Muslim Democrats of New York, Carlin Cohen of the Chinese American Planning Council, Diana Moreno of New Immigrant Community Empowerment, or NICE, and Genesis Aquino of the Laundry Worker Center. In the second and final hour of our panel, we will be joined by several mayoral candidates, and our panelists will have the opportunity to ask them questions directly. We will kind of like flip it over to them, and they'll be the ones moderating the second half of the panel. So without further ado, I'm going to kick things off with tonight's first topic for all of our panelists here this evening. This past year has been a year of tremendous hardship for immigrant communities in New York City, from the rise in hate crimes against Asian American New Yorkers to the disproportionate rate of COVID-related death and infection in many immigrant neighborhoods, to the high number of unemployment in immigrant communities in New York City. You all represent a variety of immigrant communities across the 5 boroughs. Tell us about the impact of COVID on your membership. We'll start with Carlin Cohen at the CPC.
Hi there, everyone, and thank you so much for having me tonight. My name is Carlin Cohen. My pronouns are they, them, or she, her, and I'm the Chief Policy and Public Affairs Officer at CPC, Chinese American Planning Council. CPC started in 1965 at the end of the Chinese Exclusion Act to help welcome new immigrant New Yorkers to the city and help them become familiar with the different resources available. And since then, we have grown to serve 60,000 Asian American immigrant and low-income New Yorkers across all 5 boroughs. And we have 3 community centers in Lower Manhattan, Flushing, and in Sunset Park. So we are deeply rooted in those neighborhoods particularly. Since the beginning of COVID-19, we have seen a devastating impact on our community members. And I really think of it as a triple crisis of public health, economic, and racism that our community members have experienced. We saw that at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic that our community members were struggling to access testing and treatment, that community members were unable to get information on whether they should go to the hospital or how they could get testing, how they could get care. We had community members that were scared of seeking care or testing because of their immigration status. And because of this, we had community members that died at home without ever receiving care because they were scared that their immigration status would be wielded against them if they sought treatment for COVID-19. At the same time, the data collection in New York City did not even show the true death scale of Asian American community members because our data collection mechanisms on race and ethnic subgroups are so inadequate that the deaths that we were seeing throughout our communities were actually not even being captured by the data, which meant that attention was not being paid to the specific issues that Asian American immigrants were facing under COVID-19. And even today, we're seeing that when it comes to vaccine access, that our community members are disproportionately struggling to receive the vaccine, even though many are essential workers, have been working this whole time, should be eligible. Information is not available in the languages that people speak, so it is impossible to make appointments without going through community-based organizations or family and friends that speak the language. These systems are hard enough to navigate if English is your first language, and it is hard enough to get an appointment if English is your first language. If it is not your first language and there is not language accessible resources, it's even more impossible. At the same time as that public health crisis that has devastated New Yorkers across the board, we also saw an economic crisis impacting our Asian American and immigrant communities. And in a lot of ways, the pandemic economic effect started for the Asian American community earlier than it did for the rest of us. We were already feeling the economic effects of the pandemic before the New York on pause or the shutdown of March, when businesses had seen up to 50% less business by mid-February for Asian American and particularly Chinese businesses in Manhattan, Chinatown, in Sunset Park, and in Flushing. Since then, Asian American unemployment has grown 7,000% in in the pandemic, the highest of any racial and ethnic group. And we've seen that many community members have been completely excluded from state aid and federal aid because of their immigration status. At the same time, our essential workers have been facing challenges because they have been forced to continue going to work, or if they're working in the informal economy, have been struggling to continue to maintain employment and get resources that are necessary. We've seen our food lines grow, and we've seen community members facing eviction despite the eviction moratorium. And lastly, at the same time, we have seen the effects of racism throughout this pandemic as the Black Lives Matter movement has received a resurgence in its intensity through George Floyd's murder and through the continued police brutality of Black and Brown Americans. We've also seen an increase in Asian American hate crimes. And even in the past few weeks, we've seen that resurgence again. And it's incredibly important that as communities of color, we stand in solidarity with each other and work to address racism and hate together instead of being served as a wedge. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Carlin. I'm going to go by order as folks appear in kind of like my own grid. So that means that Hanadi and Matab, please, you may go next.
Great, thank you so much. So my name is Hanadi Doda, and I am Vice President of the Muslim Democratic Club of New York. The Muslim Democratic Club of New York is a New York City-based organization of American Muslims dedicated to helping elect responsible Democrats to local office. We seek to mobilize and empower the American Muslim community in New York City by nurturing a culture of civic participation. That is really what our main goal is. And before we go deep into this, Mahta, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, Assalamu alaikum everyone. My name is Mahtab Khan. I'm the Secretary of MDCNY, that's the Muslim Democratic Club of New York. I'm glad to be here.
Great. One of the topics so we have two main topics that we're going to talk about between Mahtab and myself, and mine is what I would be really engaged and interested in speaking about is faith-based activism within New York City and understanding what that really means and looking for this new mayoral, between all the candidates that are running and with who this new mayoral individual may be, is understanding the role that faith communities play in New York City and how they run and conduct themselves as the trust factors between government and city folks, right? And trying to, in order to kind of tap into faith communities, you have to really kind of work with the faith-based institutions or the houses of worship. And this, creating this tie and creating this relationship is very key. And the interest that we have here is making sure that faith voices are heard and they are invited to the table with all issues that are happening across our city in order to, because any issues that happen really hit faith-based communities across the board. And oftentimes they don't have a seat at the table. And it's important that, this discussion is had and it is known that, we're here to speak and we're here to be heard. And what I will do right now is just hand it over to Mahtab.
Yeah. Thank you, Hanadi. And Mahtab, thank you for being here. Can you tell us a little bit more about the impact that COVID has had in your communities?
Yeah. So just to echo off what Carlin and Hanadi had mentioned, a lot of our communities have been deeply impacted by the pandemic, but I'd say the immigrant community especially has been deeply impacted because of the pandemic, and with the resources available for addressing and what to do during these times, none of it really has been all that language accessible to a lot of these communities, especially those of the Muslim community. And when applying for unemployment benefits and rent relief, they do have some restrictions that folks from the immigrant community won't be able to, it prevents them from being able to access those resources. When it comes to rent relief, someone from the household has to be a citizen, and when it comes to unemployment benefits, someone in the family would have to have work authorization or be a citizen to access those unemployment benefits. But in regards to the Muslim community, especially, our community has congregational prayers where we all come together in mass to pray together whenever we go to the masjid. And our mosques. And because of that, a lot of folks from our community haven't been able to, continue their, engagement in praying. And it's been very impactful for folks to come together. Uh, yeah, Handi, do you have any thoughts you'd like to add on to that?
Really quickly, I seen that our time is almost up. I will just just 1 second. I will add that the Muslim community was one of the first communities that when the shutdown happened, we had sent an order through our umbrella organizations throughout the city that we should not congregate together and at our houses of worship because of the safety of our communities. And it was not just particularly for the Muslim community, but through our major umbrella organizations, we sent out massive, wide, communications that we should not congregate because the focus and health of the entire community as a whole is very, very important. So I just wanted to highlight that.
Thank you for that, both of you. Up next, we have Diana Moreno from NICE. Can you tell us a little bit more, Diana, about the impact that COVID has had on your communities and on NICE as a membership?
Thank you so much, Claudia, and thank you everybody for being here. We really appreciate the mayoral candidates that are here to listen, and we are so excited to be part of this panel. It's so important for this race to really center the voices of those who have been marginalized, of those who have been completely forgotten, not just throughout this pandemic, but even before that. And that's something that I'd like to highlight because when I think about the impact that this pandemic has had on our community of immigrant workers, which is the community that NICE serves, I think of a community that was already on the edge, and this pandemic really pushed us off a cliff. It really can't be overstated the impact that this pandemic had on immigrant workers, and especially undocumented workers in New York City. As many of you know, in Jackson Heights, where NICE's Queens office is located, that was one of the early epicenters of the pandemic. And some of our members were deeply impacted, personally impacted. Never did I think as a staff member of NICE that I was going to have to call the Mexican consulate to try to figure out how to repatriate bodies that died in our neighborhoods. Never did I think that I was going to have to try to fight for city funding for funerals for our members. So this is deeply, deeply personal and emotional for all of us. And I just want to acknowledge the emotional toll that not only has it taken on our community, but people who serve this community. It's really impacted all of us personally, because many of us, for all of us, this isn't a job that we do. This is personal. This is part of our personal stories. This is part of our mission and our passion. Something that I'd like to definitely touch upon is some work that we did with Rob Smith, a professor from Baruch College in CUNY, where we actually surveyed over 6,000 immigrant workers, out of which over 40% said they were in fear of losing their home. And so we really see the impact, the domino effect of unemployment that hit our community very early, starting in March, right during the shutdown. We saw mass unemployment, and with a community that already has little savings, that already has little access to social safety nets, it was almost immediate, the eviction that folks were facing, food insecurity that folks were facing. We also run a food program that we started back last April. So it's been over 10 months of us giving food to community that is facing food insecurity. And we actually saw that every week where we actually do food deliveries for folks who couldn't leave their homes due to age, due to COVID-19, et cetera, we had to move their addresses almost every week because of that housing insecurity, where families had to actually be delivered food to a shelter, delivered food to a friend's house because they were evicted from their homes. Not only that, something that's really important for us to address is the pandemic and epidemic of workplace abuse that has unfortunately risen during this pandemic. It's been incredibly difficult for us we were already serving around 60 wage theft cases a month prior to the pandemic. And the numbers of wage theft cases that we have seen after have been ridiculous. We unfortunately have not been able to address all the wage theft cases that come through our doors. So we're asking for folks in power and politicians to address the systemic issues that were only uncovered during this pandemic. Not only have we faced the highest infection rates and the highest death rates in the entire city, we have faced the highest numbers of evictions. And again, the eviction moratorium will not stop an eviction in an underground housing economy. And the highest numbers of workplace abuse that unfortunately sometimes we're even subsidized by the city with the MTA contracting our community, immigrant workers, to clean the subways with no PPE, with really little safety concerns, and not paying them the prevailing wage. So that's something that I'm happy to go into whenever we talk a little bit about labor. But this is some of the worst impacts that our, unfortunately, our community has faced.
Thank you, Dianne. Up next, we have Maoma and Hennessy's from the Laundry Worker Center. Maoma and Hennessy's, can you tell us a little bit more about the effect that COVID has had on your membership?
First of all, I'll mention a little bit about the Laundry Worker Center. The Laundry Worker Center is a member-led organization. What we do is train workers every day so that they can fight against wage theft, which is something very common in New York City and the state. And Maoma will be talking more about how the pandemic has affected our membership. We are working on various campaigns right now. And yeah, Maoma, please.
Yes, how I can start. It is really bad because this pandemic affects in a very drastic and dramatic way, especially our members who majority are women working for the laundromat industry. These workers are considered essential workers, but many of them, or many of these workers, so the majority of these workers, they don't even have sick days because under the sick days law, many of these workers are not covered. A lot of people get sick because these workers, they had to manipulate clothes in very disgusting way. We hear comments about the workers like they had to wash clothes with human fluids, which is a high possibility these clothes are contaminated with the COVID. The companies don't provide PPE like masks, gloves, and a lot of companies right now, a lot of laundromats just basically close, and they don't pay 1 or 2 weeks to these workers. Basically, these companies, they hold the salaries. So that's a lot of stress, emotional stress, because the laundromat workers, they don't receive minimum wage. And additional to that, they had to go to work every day with the fear to probably they get sick by the COVID because they don't have the right protection. And the salaries are very, very low. A lot of workers, they've been cut hours. Sometimes they describe they don't have even money to pay the rent or had money to buy the food. So in the laundromat industry, especially in New York City, this work has been affected in really, really dramatic way.
Thank you for that, Maoma and Hennessy's. Up next is Samia from the United Arab Women. Can you tell us a little bit more about the impact that COVID has had in your community and your membership?
Hi, everyone. In the beginning, I want to thank the mayor candidates who joined us to hear what's happening in our communities. My name is Sumaya Rumaim. I'm with the with the Union for Arab Women, which is a political club for Arab and Muslim women in South Brooklyn. Actually, like through the pandemic, we were in the front line, making sure like to support our communities, whether they are Arab or non-Arab. And what we realized that the biggest problem that it faced our community, it's like the people who's undocumented, who lost their jobs, who cannot afford to pay rents. And like, you know, they have been struggling and facing a lot of problems to support their family, to their families and their children's. And also, like, you know, we tried, like, you know, to support them as much as we can with the food distribution. And like, you know, we were like doing like delivering food to their houses, but like, this is not enough. And I was like wondering what kind of support that the city can, like, you know, provide for the undocumented people who has little children who's in schools and they really need the support. And like many of them, they lost their houses, and many of our neighbors, like, you know, they moved to another cities because they cannot even, like, you know, keep paying rents while they don't have jobs. that's what I realized. And also, like, we were having like a hotline, and most of the calls that support and help, because they facing domestic violence problems, and they were like, getting abused from their husband, and the same things that most of those women are the women who's undocumented. Yeah, that's what we face as an Arab and immigrant community.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Somia. And lastly, we have Ligia Gualpa of the Workers' Justice Center. Ligia, can you tell us a little bit about the impact that COVID has had on the Workers' Justice Project's membership?
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much for organizing this conversation and centering around how to move forward in addressing workers' rights, migrant workers' rights, but also like immigration issues that our communities are facing. So Workers' Justice Project, it's a worker center that was founded in 2010. And this is the second time we have to face a crisis like this. The first time I personally remember was Hurricane Sandy, that deeply impacted particularly immigrant people of color who had to face exact same issues. And who would have imagined that as part of the organization, our communities would have had to actually face a much worse crisis, such as a pandemic. Since the before the pandemic hit, Workers' Justice Project was already responding to the deep systemic racial, ethnic, and economic inequalities that have put low-wage migrant workers and their families at risk without safety and without basic protections. And the reality is that during COVID, while many people claim we're all in this together, we know that that wasn't true. Working people, immigrants, indigenous people, people of color were the most who were suffering since COVID hit. The virus not only left people without jobs, without the opportunity to get access to healthcare, without unemployment, but it killed many of our members and many of their families, because the economic crisis and the healthcare crisis has put their entire lives at risk. And what we have been seeing through the pandemic is that, as many of the panelists have said, many jobs were gone. And the very few jobs that people were forced into taking were service jobs, such as food delivery work, which was the only jobs that immigrant workers were forced to rely as a way of survival. And while everybody, and specifically in the city, decided to shut down, Workers' Justice Project stayed open to provide emergency relief services and turn our centers into an emergency relief center, to be able to serve over 18,000 day laborers, domestic workers, and food delivery workers who were left without PPE, who were left without food, without the possibility to pay their rent. And while we turn our centers into a food relief centers, cash relief centers, we have been centering our work around organizing and making sure workers create spaces to really start defending the basic dignity and rights that they have as human beings. And I look forward to having a deeper conversation about how we can address the crisis, the workers' rights crisis, the health crisis, the many crises that our communities are facing, that it requires a new way of thinking, a new way of redesigning about how we rebuild New York City.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that, Ligia. And before I move on to the next question, I just want to acknowledge two mayoral candidates who are tuned into the conversation right now: Scott Stringer, the city controller, and Carlos Menchaca, the city council member representing Red Hook and Sunset Park in the city council. Thank you both for being here tonight. And so for my next question, I wanted to ask the panelists here tonight, the federal government has authorized relief for some mixed status families in this forthcoming round of stimulus package relief. But as we've heard many times, there's a sense that the state and local government could do more. One example is the push to pass the Invest in Our New York Act, which proposes ending tax breaks for the wealthiest New Yorkers in order to fund economic relief at the state level. So what forms of economic relief would you like to see in your communities, and how could the city's next mayor push that in his or her own agenda? You have 2 minutes to respond. Thank you. And since we'll go in opposite order from last time, so Ligia, if you would like to start. Sorry, Ligia, I think you're muted.
Yeah, sorry. Technology here. Yeah, so as you want me to ask the question or just respond? Sorry.
No, just respond. Thank you.
Okay, got it. So, one of the issues that we have been seeing in our communities, that because of the government has failed to respond to many of the crises that I just mentioned, many worker centers, community-based organizations that are actually read in this panel had to become emergency response centers, have been on the front lines responding to the many crises. And one of the many crises that we had to face is workers' rights exploitation, and the level of how many workers had to be able to rely on not only unsafe, but poverty wages jobs, who not only put their lives on the line, but many often, even though they worked long hours, couldn't even afford to pay rent, couldn't afford to buy food. And what we want to see in New York City is how we reimagine really creating enforcement mechanisms to be able to address those issues. I'm just going to give a quick example. What's happening in New York right now, food delivery workers are one of the fastest growing industries that has kept every New Yorker fed, that has kept the entire restaurant industry alive, but are struggling for the government to respond in many ways. One is facing bike robberies, facing assaults in the streets, and every time they make a report to the police continues to ignore those reports. We also are seeing wage theft happening in not only in food delivery work, but in many other industries such as construction. And what we're seeing is that many of local governments or the mayor trying to figure out how they can intervene to shut down businesses who are not committing to workplace justice practices, or intervene to make sure that the government agencies can really act as enforcement agencies to start protecting workers and start ensuring that at the same time, organizations like Workers' Justice Project, organizations that are here, are also fully funded in order for us to be able to operate and continue to act as emergency response centers the same way we have been doing the past few years.
Yeah, thank you. We're out of time. Thank you so much for your response. Up next, we have Somia from the Union of Arab Women. Can you tell us a little bit more about the forms of economic relief at the state and city level that you would like to see for immigrant communities in New York City?
Yeah, due to the pandemic, we saw many undocumented people. They didn't get any benefit of the like the money that the government gave it away for American citizen or immigrant, people who has documented. And what kind of support and plan that you have to help and to support the undocumented people who's living in New York City, which is, we know that most of them are living in Sunset Park. So that's what I'm wondering to see, if there's any plan for that. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Up next, we have Maoma and Hennessy. Can you tell us a little bit more about the forms of economic relief that you would like to see in your communities during the next mayoral administration?
So one of the issues that we are facing in New York City is that we have a basic leave law, but that is not inclusive of small industries like the laundromats. So it happens that a lot of our members are not able to get coverage. So I wanted to, one of the things that we care about is to make sure that all these mayoral candidates are pushing forward so that people who are working in sectors like the laundromats who have less than 10, 11 employees are also being covered under the law, because right now they are being affected. They don't get the luxury, they don't have the right to take days off when they are sick because they are not covered under the law. And we believe that needs to change, especially now as we are going through this pandemic.
Thank you for that, Genesis. Malma, is there anything else you would like to add before your time is up?
So just basically the message is like for economic relief, this is about humanity. It's not like if the people have documents or they have, because a lot of people contribute with this economy, and we repeat it again and again to the official electors and the politicians. This matter is about humanity, because everybody in this country will contribute to growing in an economic way to this nation. And just basically because you don't have documents or you are married with a person with no documents, you've been excluded. But everybody here, we pay taxes. And those taxes also help to pay the salaries to all these politicians. So we are asking the politicians just basically to support what they have to do, which is the working class and not the capitalisms or the corporations. Because during this pandemic, a lot of corporations make more money thanks to the pandemic. So basically the message is like, this is a issue about humanity. Is like those immigrants who don't have documents but pay taxes, they are paying the salary of these politicians. So we are demanding, we are not asking, we are demanding, do the right thing, which is find a way in order to support these immigrants who are being excluded for everything.
Thank you, Malma. Thank you. Up next, we have Anadi and Matab from the Muslim Democrats of New York. Can you tell us a little bit more about what some forms of economic relief would you like to see for immigrant communities?
Yeah, I can just take a quick stab at this. I mean, I'm not going to say anything that hasn't been already heard and been echoed by my fellow panelists. There is something that I think I would love to highlight and also remind all of the candidates and really everyone that's here is safe and easy access for all people within our communities to get the vaccine if they choose to get it. I think that is something that's super important and very should be at the top of all of our lists is easy access for our immigrant communities, our faith-based communities, and really communities all across the board, regardless of immigration status, to be able to have access to that vaccine. We have seen several times where there have been appointments in certain communities of Black and Brown people, and their appointments are being taken by people that live in other neighborhoods. And that is super indicative of what's happening right now, especially what's happening in Sunset Park. I'm from Sunset Park, and I have been trying for weeks to get my parents an appointment at the Armory, and I cannot. It's just because it's just, there's no access to it. And I think for me, that's one of the points I want to highlight. I want to give Mahtab the final minute.
Yeah, thank you, Hamdi. For me, for like speaking on behalf of the Muslim community, what I feel would be the best, main priorities in helping us recover from this pandemic is ensuring that we forgive the debt that taxi medallion owners have. There's over 950 of them taxi medallion owners who are having to file for bankruptcy because they're unable to afford or pay off that debt, and because of that they're forced to lose their income, their homes, and it's very tragic. I feel like we should also be prioritizing on opening up the unemployment and rent relief program for the immigrant community, especially those who are undocumented and haven't been receiving any help since the pandemic has begun. And also, in order for a lot of this to get done, we need to prioritize on taxing the rich It's something that hasn't been as highlighted until recently because of the pandemic, because in order for us to recover soundly, we need all the funds, and we had to hold the upper class, the top 1% accountable, and ensure that they pay their fair share and help the people, because without that, we are at so much risk, and our time is very limited from how we approach this pandemic and find a resolution that works for everyone.
Thank you, Mata. We're a little bit over time, but thank you for
Mhm.
that. Up next is Diana Moreno from NICE. Sorry, Diana, I skipped over you earlier. So can you tell us a little bit more about the forms of economic relief you would like to see for immigrant communities in New York in this next mayoral administration?
Yes, thank you so much. First, I'd like to contextualize our situation, because I think it's easy to say, the federal government has failed, our state has failed. I think, especially in the last 4 years, the federal government hasn't just failed our communities; they have intentionally excluded and hurt our communities. And so, if we want to lead in the restoration of the dignity of our community, we have to do some restorative justice, right? So we can't just say, oh, we will do better. No, we have to commit ourselves to restore the dignity of a community that has been explicitly and intentionally excluded through racist and terrorizing actions, such as Homeland Security, ICE. The mayor of New York is not just the mayor of our city. It is a national political figure. So not only do we expect for citywide policies to be enacted to improve the dignity and the livelihood of our communities, but we expect for the next mayor to flex every political muscle at the federal level, at the state level, to get better things for our immigrant worker community. And so not only does that look like taxing the rich, absolutely, we need to tax the rich. And again, this is not a matter of just smart public policy. It's a matter of justice. It's ridiculous that such a rich city like New York City, the richest city in the entire world, has people sleeping out in the streets during this harsh winter after a year of a pandemic. It is absolutely ludicrous and a humanitarian crisis. And so we absolutely need to tax the rich, but we also have to invest back in public infrastructure. It is public transportation that impacts immigrant communities like ours. When the subways were not being used during the beginning of the pandemic, our people were still using the subways because they could not choose not to. It is Black and brown folks that were still riding the subway, still riding the bus, regardless of the safety involved, because they needed to get to work, because they could not get unemployment. They were not eligible for relief. And so it is that investment in infrastructure and that investment in a public safety net at the city level that will absolutely impact communities of color disproportionately in a positive way rather than in a negative way. And lastly, we have to fund organizations like NICE, organizations like the ones here, like Worker Justice Project, because unfortunately we have also been dealing with budget cuts. So it is organizations that are in the front lines that have not closed their doors throughout this pandemic to serve our community that are being actually in the chopping block. And it's us that have to deal with the budget crises that is created through lack of taxing the rich.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Diana. We've run out of time, but thank you so much for that. Lastly, we have Carlin. Can you tell us a little bit more about the forms of economic relief you would like to see in your community? So you have 2 minutes.
Absolutely. So first of all, just want to amplify everything that all of the other panelists have said 100%. When we have seen food lines wrapping around the block increasingly and our community members are rationing food, relief at the federal and state level is insufficient. And when the wealthiest New Yorkers have gained over $60 billion during this pandemic, relief is inequitable. And the city can do so much to center immigrant New Yorkers in a just economic recovery. Yes, a lot of that means pushing at the state level to invest in our New York, to pass the New York Health Act for real rent relief that doesn't involve means testing and includes our mixed status and undocumented families and our families in informal economies and jobs as well. But there's also a lot that can be born out of the city level. We saw it, the city's own fund for excluded workers was started at the beginning of the pandemic, and our organization was a part of administering that, but it was a drop in the bucket compared to the need of our communities, and we could do so much more with that. The city also needs to make sure we're providing protections for workers. Our essential workers have been out working this whole time without, as many of the other panelists have said, the ability to access vaccine in low income and communities of color, without the ability to safely quarantine from their families, without the ability to make sure that they are able to keep their families in their homes without fear of eviction or predatory landlords. The city can include protections for our workers, making sure that workers in the informal economy, day laborers, sex workers, all of those workers have protections under the City of New York. The City of New York can ensure that we are prioritizing language access and language justice for our workers in all of these efforts, and putting our immigrant workers at the center of economic relief rather than as an afterthought. And lastly, it's critical that the city continue to fund the organizations that serve those New Yorkers, that do it in the language and with cultural competence, community-based organizations that have been on the ground since day one. It is incredibly important.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that, Carlin. And for my next question, I just want to, the following question is for Genesis and Malma from the Laundry Worker Center, Diana from NICE, and Leah from the Workers' Justice Project. You know, over the last year, especially, you know, during the worst of the pandemic, we've seen a tremendous amount of organizing around New York City's essential workers, from Los Deliveristas Unidos, from WJP, to laundry workers, domestic cleaners, industrial cleaners, and all sorts of workers who kept our city safe and running during the worst periods of the lockdown. Can you tell us a little bit more about what is the path forward in collective organizing for these workers? You know, what's next, kind of like in the future, kind of like the labor movement for gig workers and those in the so-called informal economy? We can start with Leah from the Workers' Justice Project.
Yeah, so this past year, it's incredible to say that it's been a year already of suffering. So this past year, workers across many industries had no choice of survival, trying to find ways to resist, survive through organizing. And food delivery workers is just one of the fastest growing industries that has kept the economy alive and many New Yorkers fed. And it is not surprised to hear that while app companies like Relay, Uber have really come to our city to profit from the pandemic, has decided to offer no essential protections. And when food delivery workers were struggling to access bathrooms, were struggling to access PPE, had to invest over $2,000 just to work, workers were suffering the most. And October 15, they said enough is enough, and they decided to organize and start demanding for the government to intervene and start regulating one of the fastest, if not the only growing industry that New York City has, which is access to bathroom, personal protective equipment, hazard pay, and the right of representation. I know at the federal government there is a PRO Act, but we strongly feel that New York City has the power and the ability to ensure workers have essential protections, so they have the right to gain and win full representation. And Los Deliveristas Unidos is just one of the growing and fastest growing sectors that are actually demanding that, the most basic right to have representation when it comes to negotiating their survival and their dignity with some of the most powerful companies, such as Grubhub, DoorDash, who have more than 60% of the food delivery industry. And we feel the mayor has the right and has the power to do that, which is guarantee essential protections and representation.
Thank you for that, Leah. Next up, we have Diana Moreno from NICE. Can you tell us a little bit more about the future of organizing for your membership and for immigrant workers in New York City?
Thank you. The future of organizing is coming together and understanding that our immigrant workers are workers, and they should be able to join labor unions to be to get the types of benefits and the type of actual living wage that it requires to live in a city like New York. We have a great relationship with labor unions, especially in the construction industry, and have worked together with them to pass legislation to protect immigrant workers. But it's time for the city to actually lead on issues that could actually facilitate our members' entrance into labor unions, such as banning E-Verify. E-Verify is a federal program that has been utter and complete failure, and it continues to discriminate against workers, especially immigrant workers, and impose that failed federal program on the city and on our state. We could be leaders in banning something like E-Verify to facilitate the entrance of our workers in labor unions. That's only one idea. We also must ensure that if any company that works with the city or any organization or any city agency or state agency, such as the MTA, for example, is contracting workers and contracting immigrant workers like they did during the pandemic to clean the subways, that those workers are being provided PPE, those workers are being provided the prevailing wage that is promised to MTA workers, which many workers who worked in cleaning the subways did not receive. And if they didn't, then they need to receive a retroactive pay, because we can no longer have injustices go unaddressed. They need to be retroactively paid for the abuse and the wage shortages that they have faced. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Diana. Right now we have Maoma and Genesis from the Laundry Worker Centers. Tell us a little bit more about the future of organizing in your industry. You have 2 minutes. Hello, Genesis, are you there?
Yes, I am here.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
So, yeah, as right now, our main priority is to make sure that the health of our workers are being protected. So we want to ask all the mayor candidates, what are they going to do to extend paid sick leave to laundry workers and to any other workers that are working in small industries. We also want to know what can they do to strengthen unions, union organizing, union membership. Right now, we are confronting an LLC that just closed their doors because the workers decided to fight and demand fair wages and demand PPE. What are the mayor candidates going to do to ensure that employers are providing PPE? And that's not just a responsibility for the employer,
facilitate
for the workers.
Entrance into labor union.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Genesis. Maoma, can you tell us a little bit more about the future of organizing for laundry workers in New York City, and how perhaps the past year has galvanized some of their effort? 1 more minute left, I think.
So yes, in order to organize, we believe all the struggles we won with the power of the workers, but in that process also we need tools, and those tools is basically, we know when the city really wants and put all the energy to pass laws or sign laws, they do it. So basically, in order to have a better organizing process in the future, we need the power of the mayor be in favor of the workers, and because right now the enforcement in all the agencies are very weak. They have things about protections, about PPV, about the COVID, but the enforcement, nobody respect those laws or all these executive orders, who basically is for protection of the workers. The employers know very well they can violate all these laws or all these orders, and it's basically we are in circles because we say we have these protections, but in reality nobody respect that. So how the mayor, what they gonna do in order to be more strong, in order to enforce those laws, who those laws are basically as a tool to organize.
Thank you, Malma, for that. I'm going to move on to our final question for the panelists before we move on to the Q&A portion of our event. And so this final question is for Samia from the Union of Arab Women and Matab and Hanari from the Muslim Democratic Club of New York. You know, the pandemic has shown the role that faith-based community leaders play as agents of trust and sources of information and aid for their communities, from mutual aid relief to getting people signed up for vaccines and tests and so on and so forth. Can you tell us a little bit more about the lessons you've learned in the past year? And can you also tell us about how community leadership can tap into these communities for our short and long-term recovery? You each have 2 minutes. We can start with Matab and Anari.
Great. Mahtab, if you don't mind, I'll just jump in quickly. What I've seen within my work within the last year is that faith-based communities have a large burden on their shoulders to not only educate their congregations and communities about what is happening like during the pandemic. Some people don't have, the language access, whether it's the news or the internet. Two is trying to really mobilize their communities in taking the proper steps and measures in being safe. And what we're looking for is how to continue this going within the next year or so, whether it's more access to internet, because some areas don't have as much internet. And it's thinking about ways to provide faith-based communities, organizations, houses of worship with the right amount of PPE, with the right sanitizers, with whatever is needed within these communities, because oftentimes these communities are communities of color and they lack this certain necessities to be able to give back to their communities and to be able to push them forward. I will let Mahtab take more.
Yeah, I would say the biggest lesson in this pandemic is that we're all in this together, and without one another working together, it will be harder for us to recover from this pandemic. That's why we need to push for change together, whether it be fighting to tax the rich or restoring municipal voting rights for the immigrant community, because they've been left out of the process. And I'd like to also commend the New York Immigrant Coalition for fighting on that and always working towards addressing it. During these times, we've heard the expression "no taxation without representation." But a lot of communities, from the immigrant community, they've been paying taxes but still haven't been receiving that representation. Not being able to vote, participate in elections, getting that rent relief, getting that unemployment benefit. But I feel like for us to, work towards finding a solution for this, we all need to come together, different communities.
Be able to push them forward.
Yeah, fight together. Work together to address the changes we need.
Thank you for that, and Nari. Now we move to Samia from the Union of Arab Women.
Yeah. So since the pandemic started, we have been in the front line because we feel the responsibility that we have. And we were in the front line, making sure that community received the services and the support that they needed, especially as I said before, the undocumented people who were struggling to get the donation and support from people. And they were actually scared because we have the good trust with the community, and we know many people who really need support and they don't like to share their own story, personal story. And what I realized that is through the pandemic, as I said, the domestic violence were crazy at that time, and we had to connect the mayor office to make sure that there is having mental health services and support online. And also we tried our best to make sure that we are registering people, educate people about how much it's important to vote, because all what's happening with the pandemic, that shows us what leaderships do we have, and we have to change them, and we have to make sure that we have the right people who can listen to us, who can support our community, and who can support especially the community of colors who needs a lot of support. And we were in the front line giving away food and doing voter registration and telling people what kind of services outside, refer them to the organization that they do the work to support them. And like we just like, for the next step for us, we're just gonna keep organizing community, keeping support our community, and making sure that we elect the right people who are gonna listen to us and support our communities.
Thank you for that. And now, without further ado, I know that we're running a little bit behind time, so I wish that we could keep this discussion going. But right now, we do move on to the portion where you all get to ask the mayoral candidates on the lines your own questions and kind of like steer the conversation yourselves. You've all prepared a list of questions that you would like to ask the mayoral candidates on the line now. We have Carlos Menchaca, the council member representing Red Hook and Sunset Park in the city council, and Dianne Morales. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm going to start in order. I'm going to start calling you all out individually in the order that the questions are in this document that we've put together. So Mahtab, can you start off with your question, please?
Yeah. Hi, Diane and Carlos. My question was, do you support the Invest in Our New York Act and taxing the rich?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
What he
absolutely.
said. What he said. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely, unequivocally.
Mm-hmm. And just to jump off on that, can you tell us a little bit more about the forms of economic relief that you support for, that will impact immigrant communities in New York City? Dianne, we can start with you.
Sure. I mean, I think our immigrants communities should have all of the same protections that everyone else has access to, right? We should be providing healthcare. We should be providing, a safety net. We should be providing access to everything that we provide to documented citizens, and all of the supports and all of the protections that we give to anyone else. We know who the lifeblood of this city is. We know who keeps this city running. We know who has been operating the city throughout the course of the last 12 months in particular, who the lifeblood, who the heart and soul is of our city. So they deserve all the same protections that we would. Actually, we should be giving everybody more protections, and the immigrant community should be included in that as well.
Thank you for that. Carlos?
Yeah, thank you. And I agree. Protections are really important to ensure that everybody has access to them. And I think just the discussion today brings us together in terms of the day laborers and the laundry workers and the nail salon workers and the street vendors. And all these are essential workers. They're out there every day without many protections because of their status. And I think your question was about the economic relief. And that's what I'm thinking about too, and really building out city-funded programs, a universal basic income program, where many of you were part of the city's rollout of the economic relief that came from a foundation, and they just push that work onto you without giving you more dollars for staffing. And in some ways, like, how do you say no to those dollars? But on top of your mutual aid that you're working on, we're not fortifying your organizations with the ability to actually do that work, and without even putting tax dollars. And so those are the kind of things that are important. And when I think about economic relief, is to keep you all strong in these moments. And from now on, Sandy showed us how the day laborers came out and did the work to rebuild neighborhoods. And that was a crisis. This became bigger. Climate change is gonna be 13,000 times bigger in terms of how we're going to experience it. And so now is the time to actually put that together to ensure that we can actually make that happen with all of you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that, Carlos and Dianne. I wanted to give you both some space before we move on to the next round of questions to share more broadly your own platforms for immigrant relief and, to help our immigrant communities thrive in New York City. Dianne, since I know that you have to hop off for another event, we can start with you. You have 2 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And I'm sorry that I do have to hop off. I actually was supposed to be at an event at 6 o'clock and asked to delay that because I did want to have the opportunity to just pop in and show my support. I'm so thankful to be here with all of you alongside so many of the organizations that I know have held it down, and held down the front lines for our immigrant and worker communities, particularly those who were especially vulnerable during this pandemic. And I'm thankful to the Brooklyn district leaders who made it possible for me to be here today and invited me to speak. You know, I've been working for over 25 years, meeting the needs of New Yorkers when our systems have failed. You know, I spent 6 years as the executive director at The Door. And one of the critical things that we did in that capacity was actually to provide legal support and representation to young people who were here without documentation, and young people who were fighting to be able to stay here. You know, I'm from here, I'm from the city. I taught here in the city. I've raised my family here, and I've been an organizer here in the city. And, you know, that has given me a front row seat to the failed systems, but also to the hope that our communities represent. And it's those combination of experiences that led me to enter into this race. I'm a first generation Boricua, born and raised in Bed-Stuy, to a working class family and the single mother who has, you know, of two, who's raised my children in the same community. So many of my experiences, despite having citizenship, are reflective of some of the challenges that our communities face. And, you know, and at the same time, I've had the benefit and the privilege of being a successful executive and leader of human service organizations that has dedicated myself to helping others navigate those same challenges and live in dignity. New York is my city. I was born and raised here. This is a part of my core. It's a part of my center. And it's part of why I think it's so important to get involved in organizing and support the community. You know, we watched over the last 12 months as Wall Street and the stock market got stronger, while our already weakened systems were, you know, created an even deeper inequity in our schools, our health facilities, and our neighborhoods. I don't think the problem is money. I think the problem is our priorities and, you know, the ongoing failure of the administration to really address the root causes of our challenges. So I am committed to disrupting the status quo. I'm not talking about taking the city back to normal. I'm talking about creating a new New York City in partnership with all of you. I think that we can live up to the rhetoric of being the greatest city in the world, and fulfilling the American dream for our communities as well. So I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you so much for giving me the time. I'm so sorry to run, but I expect to see you all, you know, if not on the streets, then in the policy rooms. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dianne.
Take care.
Thank you. Take care. Carlos, would you please, you know, tell us a little bit more about your own vision and platform for immigrant New Yorkers in New York City?
Yeah, thank you. And so much of the platform is built by the people in this room, the organizers in this room, the movement leaders in this room. And so we're no stranger to each other in the work that we've been doing. I'm also the chair of the immigration committee. So much of this really starts in deep partnership. And so maybe there's about 4 different areas that I want to talk about quickly. One of them is access to legal services. So much of what we want and need require lawyers that are supporting many of our workers who are wages are being stolen. They're in deportation proceedings. Many are able to get citizenship. We want lawyers to ensure that we get what people need. But we want to make sure that everybody can get access to that, and that's paying for that service. The second thing is police and accountability. So much of what we're doing right now is, and you know that I believe in abolishing ICE, but we also have to really abolish the relationship between our police department and ICE and everything that's connected to that. Our city continues to, we have 1 more minute to do that. So I think there's a big category of work that we can do to remove that power from our local police department. The third piece is healthcare. We can actually build a program that allows for everyone to get access to healthcare. This pandemic showed us how important that is, and I think there's a lot of different ways we can do it by listening to all of you. The next really important piece is adult education. So much of our need for improving everything is bringing adult education. I've been a fierce fighter for that to increase, but we're percentage down the way to get everybody access in their neighborhood with organizations that they can trust, to make sure that people have access to learning English and to changing and transforming their way of civically engaging, getting a job, finding love, organizing in communities. And I think that's really important to this larger vision. And then finally, I'm thinking about workers and work, like, for example, just the day laborers themselves. This is an initiative that grew out of the city council in partnership with the day laborers to ensure that they had what they need. And everyone's asking for that. So we need to do more of that, not at a city council level, but really at a citywide level to ensure that this is an engine that we're supporting with funding.
Mhm. Thank you, thank you. We are out of time, but you have the floor now. You're the only mayoral candidate here right now, so you have the opportunity to answer questions directly from the rest of our panelists. So
Great.
up next we have Anadi. You have the floor now for your question.
Hey, Hanadi, good to see you.
Hey, Carlos, it's nice to see you. I'm really glad to actually see you tonight and have this conversation with you on a whole. My question to you is, shall you win and become mayor? How do you plan on engaging faith-based communities throughout New York City, and how will you address racism and violence towards said communities throughout the city? There's been an uptick throughout certain communities, and just wanting to know how you will address those things. Thank you.
So thank you for that question. And I heard you earlier speak to the importance of our faith leaders. Our faith leaders are in so many ways, the central spaces where people can organize and feel trust. Messages get communicated, and you talked about that, bringing the messages out to the masses. That is something that we feel deeply in Sunset Park. There's a church and a mosque, and there's a religious fabric that a neighborhood, and we're not unique. This is big across this city, and so I think it's just really partnering in more deep relationship building with our religious community to ensure that they have what they need. We also know that our religious communities are taking on so many other burdens, like ensuring that there are after-school programs and adult education programs and organizing. When we were doing all our work around Industry City, we went to the faith-based organizations to make sure that they knew what was going on. And a lot of anti-eviction programs are rooted within, I'm thinking about like CUF, that are rooted within the Catholic Church. And so they are important. And I'm also thinking, and I'd love to get, if this is a conversation that we can have, a reporter recently asked me about Borough Park and this moment where many of the religious leaders there really confronted government, and because of misinformation, really created a very dangerous and tense moment. What happens there? What did we do wrong as a city? And then I'm going to pull the census out, and as the co-chair of the task force, where we brought total of $40 million to organizations to do this work. What do we miss there, where we were not able to translate some of that relationship into action? And so I want to learn from that, where we have to just do better. But you are all as organizers also embedded in our religious communities. And I'm thinking about participatory budgeting, for example, in Sunset Park. I got to go to churches and go up and speak about participatory budgeting and I'm an openly gay legislator, and I got invited to speak on these issues. And I think that's the power of relationship that needs to be at the top with the mayor.
Thank you for that, council member. Up next, we have a question from Ligia Hualpa from the Workers' Justice Project. Ligia, I know that you wrote down 2 questions, but if you could just do one for now, just to be fair to everyone's time. And if at the end we have some extra time, you can, and others can ask additional questions.
Hola, Ligia.
There you go, the mute one. Yeah. So yes, well, I'll just get to ask on how do you plan to protect and prepare essential workers? And I'm specifically speaking about all workers who have been on the front lines in this case, but also delivery workers, house cleaners, day laborers, and other undocumented and immigrant workers who have been playing a very vital role in the recovery as emergency response workers who have no rights and no protections and no representation.
So Ligia, when I think about protection, I'm thinking about the most immediate thing right now, which are vaccines. And this was mentioned earlier. We need to ensure that everyone gets safe access to the vaccine if they choose to take the vaccine. We are failing. Language access is one of those biggest issues right now in any service, but but we should take COVID and the vaccine as a case in point and put all our resources, and whatever we develop, we keep it strong and we grow it to everything that we do in the city of New York. So that's one. And I think that we can see immediate results. And I know you and I are not stranger to the things that we're working on right now to ensure that our delivery workers are everything that they need is offered. And that means that the city and the state are creating requirements for workers that often can't get that from their employers. And so we know that there are nonprofits that are coming together and saying, we can actually help. It's doing more of that. The other kind of piece to the protection that I'm thinking about is laws. Somebody mentioned E-Verify. There is a law in the state right now, I think Ramos has it, where we can actually remove the requirement to have E-Verify used by cities and municipalities. What's preventing us from making that a critical thing in this budget in April 1st? And so I think that there's a situation with immigrant workers that gets siloed. We just saw a death recently on a construction site in Manhattan. This happens all the time. And so if we can get workers to unite, and I'm thinking about the deliveristas and the construction workers and the street vendors and the laundry workers, if every one of those workers got together and built a powerful movement and shut the city down, we would actually be able to see government respond. I'm only one voice in the city council, and I'm using every ounce of power, but we need more than just one member. And I know I see time here, but I think when I think about protections, I think about the rising up of all of these workers and building some kind of movement, some kind of labor. Because I think what we saw, and Nika, you saw this too, the building trades came together, I think very, very in new ways in partnership. And so we saw late laws change, and Jamani and I led that work inside of the city council. And I think that was just in one area. Imagine if all workers got together and shut the city down and made something happen. And I'm not talking about when I'm mayor, I'm talking about now.
Sorry.
We have a budget to pass. Sorry, I can
Thank
keep
you. So we're moving on to the next question. Don't worry. The next question is from, I believe, Somia from the Union of Arab Women. You have the floor now to ask your question to the council member.
Hi, Sonia. Somia.
Hi, Carlos. How are you?
Good to see you.
Good. So I have a question about
Sorry, Somia, your audio is kind of broken out.
When you, if you're gonna be the okay, do you hear me?
You're coming in better, yes.
Yeah, we can
Try
hear
again.
you now.
No. Do you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. I think the surface here is really bad. So basically, like if you're gonna be the next mayor, you are planning to do it and to offer the undocumented people, especially the people that they get hit badly because of the pandemic. So I just want to hear from you about that. Yeah.
I want to repeat back the question just so you can know if I heard it right. What are we going to do to support immigrants who have been impacted negatively by COVID?
Yeah, especially the undocumented people who didn't get any kind of support from the government.
Good, thank you. So we spoke in a lot of ways. This has been we've been hitting this question from a couple different answers. One is that the city of New York needs to invest city tax levy money to bring relief to undocumented workers and undocumented people of New York who are not connected to federal stimulus. And this is something that we brought up to the mayor last year in the budget negotiations. And he said, no, because $20 million is what we got from the foundations, and that's enough. That is not enough. We know that there could be up to 500,000 people who are in some way in some kind of undocumented status, but without any direct relief. What we also know, and this is just through my work as a city council member, is that many of the families that are in deep need right now, in serious urgent need, have never really connected to government because they had jobs and they were working really hard. And so now, because they're unlocked from relief from the federal government and a job because the city is shut down, they have nowhere to go. They don't have a relationship with an organization, and they are in a blind spot, and they're going hungry. And we know that they're showing up to you too. There's a lot of new people that we've never seen show up at a line at a mutual aid organization. And so there is a massive need. And the first thing that we can do is actually put funding, a kind of gesture that the city cares for our undocumented essential workers. And someone mentioned the MTA. I think it was Diana who's talked about the MTA and the workers that are getting pulled into the MTA cleaning that's happening. All of these workers now need to be supported, and that's through direct relief from the city of New York.
Thank you for that, council member. Diana from NICE has the next question. Diana, you're up.
Thank you so much, Carlos. So nice to see you and nice to have you
Me
here.
too.
So something that obviously our immigrant communities are so interested in paying a lot of attention to is what's happening at the federal level right now with immigration reform. The potential for immigration reform, maybe the first time in decades that we've had the chance for a path to immigration. And as you know, so many New Yorkers have been waiting decades, over 3 decades, for a path towards a dignified life of full citizenship and full rights. And so my question to you is, if you were mayor, if Congress were to pass the U.S. Citizenship Act of 2021, how do you as mayor plan to utilize city agencies, resources, funding to ensure that immigrant New Yorkers can finally obtain that path to citizenship?
So we've done this before, and I'm thinking about census, I'm thinking about IDNYC, I'm thinking about you all. You all need to be fully funded to ensure that there is direct communication in languages that are needed to every corner of the city. So that's one, is the engine. We need an engine to ensure that everyone has the information. 2, legal services. Right now, we do everything we can to provide a lawyer for anyone who is in a deportation proceeding. I think we need to have that same commitment to anyone who is on their way and path. CUNY Citizenship Now is a great model, but I think it's not going to be enough. I think we're going to have to really expand that and ensure that we have all the lawyers necessary to get everybody in their application and their documents ready. And this is a critical moment for the city to make that commitment. And I know that I will be the strongest voice in that as mayor to ensure that all the agencies are working together. I'm thinking about the Department of Education and how we can bring information through our kids at school, who bring vital information back home to parents that may have been afraid for years to connect to a PTA, a council member's office, an organization, but a kid will understand what's going on because they've been watching what's going on over the last 4 years and bring that information home. So this is all hands on deck to ensure that the final protection of a full citizenship status can be brought to, naturalization can be brought to our New Yorkers. And then we can have them vote in the federal elections. But we can do better now and pass a law to allow for undocumented and any immigrant the ability to vote in our municipal elections to keep our representation diverse and being able to connect to constituency like immigrants.
Thank you, council member. Malma from the Laundry Worker Center has the next question. Malma, are you there? Or Hennessy's from the Laundry Worker Center? Either of you are next.
1 second.
Okay, I think, okay, there you are, Malma. Okay, you have the next question for the council member. Thank you.
I'm so sorry. Carlos, how will you support local universal health care in New York City to exclude workers, and also funding the organizations for fight against wage theft?
So you're asking 2 different questions that are connected to the life of a worker. One is the connection to healthcare. And we talked a little bit about how we can actually build a program in the city of New York utilizing our health and hospitals that are right now being used in ways that are not only inefficient, our emergency rooms, but can actually build a program. And many of you have actually already started talking about how we bring primary care to communities and utilizing clinics and organizations that are already connecting people to primary care. So that's one, just remove the barrier and fund it. Because of the changes in healthcare, and this is allowing for people with insurance to move around. Most of the people who are now in our city hospitals are uninsured, which means that we have to do a lot more to pay for healthcare. Well, if we're going to be paying a lot more in healthcare, let's build a system around it. Let's bring an insurance program around it. And that's something I think that is not something that the current administration thinks about. Now let's shift over to our essential workers. In this last minute, I want to talk a little bit about how our workers right now are just not protected. And I think we're talking about the laundry workers. There are a lot of workers that are outside the paid sick leave, for example. We need to change laws, and we have the legislation. The city council is not moving forward, and that's because the mayor is not even willing to look at it. And the way that the city council works is if the mayor if it's a drop dead issue, the city council will not prioritize that. And that's just the way that we are. But a movement can actually shift and change the way that we can pass legislation to protect workers. And that's the quick of it. But we're gonna need a mayor to signal to the legislative body that I want to signal to the city council, I want to see a bill that protects workers. Show me.
Mhm. Thank you for that, council member. Carlin Cohen from the Chinese American Planning Council is up next.
Carlin.
Hi, Carlos. Thank you so much for being here and for your words today. As you are well familiar with, we've seen a concerning increase in anti-Asian discrimination and harassment during this pandemic, with a really disturbing surge in hate crimes recently. And some immigrant community members are calling for more policing as a response to this, while others of us are concerned that not only does policing fail to address the root problems, but it actually takes away from providing services for our communities while harming solidarity with Black and Latinx community members, understanding that particularly Black New Yorkers are disproportionately harmed by policing. So I would love to know from you what the city should do to address these anti-Asian hate crimes, and also what your vision for community safety is.
Thank you, Carlin. Today, the city came together at Foley Square, and I know there were a lot of elected officials, and the mayor was there. The Asian American Federation put together really great. So it's more of that, but in a lot of ways, when we're thinking about government, our government officials are actually not living up to the words that I'm hearing, even in spaces like that. For example, one, I think that there's a real moment right now to say to you that I do not believe more police is going to solve this issue. When I'm thinking about the questions about the faith leaders, for example, how do we bring faith leaders into this conversation that allows us to speak to multiple components of a neighborhood fabric, so that we can bring more messages of love and solidarity, allowing for, and there was a recent attack in Sunset Park that I think a lot of us saw, where it was just incredibly tragic. And so much of that, when you start looking at what's going on, the incredible stress, the toxic level of stress in our immigrant communities is real as well. And I want to be able to support families with healthcare, with education, to ensure that they have what they need. But police is not the answer. That's one thing that's really important. We got to actually move police out of these situations and bring social workers and mental health workers. But there needs to be more opportunities for us to co-collaborate on projects in our neighborhoods, especially where we see a rise in specifically anti-Asian tensions, but also our Muslim community. And as someone who's Mexican American, the Mexican American or Mexican hate that happened right after Trump, when Trump was running, was also big. And what we're looking at the end of the day, and I don't know if I have any more time, but these are attacks on low-income workers. These are working families that are getting attacked at the end of the day, who are on the way going home, and that's who's being attacked. So I just more socioeconomic support for families.
Mhm. Thank you for that, council member. I would just like to follow up, because we have seen such a dramatic rise in anti-Asian American hate crimes in New York City, what specific, I know you've talked about a lot of, like putting in social services involved and moving away from policing, but what can be done if you were, say, mayor right now? What would you do to stop the rise in crimes right now? Is it a public, service announcement? Is it kind of like, more community outreach? Like what can we do to kind of like stop these like really awful acts right now?
I've been thinking a lot about this too, and where our mayor is and what he says and how much time he spends on saying what needs to be a focus on this issue, not just at an event that the community pulls together, but every day has to be talking about this on Brian Lehrer, on and really affirmatively um, uh, speaking to the fact that our communities are speaking directly to the hate that is happening and calling it what it is. And I think that's the one thing that the bully pulpit gives us as elected officials, is to be able to do that, but to be also in presence with community members to show that there is deep level of an intimate level of government and community support. But the other thing is bringing more resources to communities that can actually do things. So I'm thinking about, and I would love to kind of hear from all of you, and Carlin, maybe you can talk a little bit about this. Like what is CPC doing right now, and why can't the city just put 5 times more dollars to do that? So much of what I think we ask government to do, and say, can you solve this problem? But so many of these issues can get solved in communities if they have the resources. And so that's what government needs to do. We need to resource our community responses. And sometimes it's art. Sometimes it's a panel discussion. Sometimes, and I know that we're in COVID right now, so we're all kind of separated, and we're living through a lot of mental health issues. All of us. I'm often not okay. And so how do we bring more resources to communities that need them? And I'm talking about organizations. And so if I could give you a question, Carlin, like what is CPC doing now? And if I was mayor, I would say, what do you need? And how can we fund it?
Mhm.
Yeah. Can I respond?
Sure.
Yeah, I think that's such a great question, and one that I really want to hear more of as we have these conversations is like asking organizations that are doing the work on the ground, what do you need to do the work? And I think that what we've certainly seen is that there is so much more work that we're suddenly needing to do and suddenly being asked to do within our communities. And we have the relationships, we have the trust, all of those things to do this work. We've been hosting, community conversations on WeChat or in our programs on our Zooms. We're trying to offer additional mental health resources and supports. And then of course, like just addressing people's basic and material needs. And I think that oftentimes we are really constrained by number one, the lack of funding, but then also the inflexibility of it. Our staff are running around trying to put together these really in-depth discussions and draw on facilitation expertise that they're trying to build as we go and really like make a difference. And they're also trying to at the same time put together food pantries from scratch that we never used to have because you can't even begin to address these kind of broader conversations and change minds and hearts without, first filling people's stomachs. And when we see like, oh, we would really love to do this thing because our community members are asking for it and they trust us to do it, but our funding source says we can only do X, Y, and Z instead. And we've already had staff cut and our staff are already overworked. That is so difficult. And so what would it look like if we actually empowered the community-based organizations that have that trust and are doing that work and said like, hey, instead of the city putting out a contract and saying, we think you should do X, Y, and Z, and it's so incredibly strict. And also whoever says that they can do it for the least amount of money is the one that's going to get it. What would it look like to go to those organizations and go to people and say, what are the things that you actually need? And what are your innovative ideas for how you can make it happen? And here's the money to do it, to be nimble and innovative and creative.
Thank you for that.
That's it. That's the answer, Claudia, right there. And imagine if the mayor came out and asked that and said, this is what we need to do. And that's just not happening.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that, all. Sammy, the district leader for North Brooklyn, has some questions for the council member. I believe, Sammy, you have the floor. If you could just do one of your two questions for now, and maybe if at the end we have a little extra time, you and Lihia can ask your additional questions. Thank you. Sammy, are you there? Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Carlos Menchaca, for joining. And you led a lot of immigrant issues in the New York City Council, so thank you for being that voice. What has happened with the bill about voting for undocumented workers? There's a current bill. Where is it going? And what do you think should be the bills for the next council?
So you're asking about the voting bill. We've introduced it into the city council. We need to ensure that the language allows for undocumented workers. I know that earlier versions really spoke to immigrants who only had a kind of green card and some kind of status. So we need to talk about that in the city council. And I don't think that that's a very popular thing right now, but I think with movement and push, we can make that happen. I think that some of the bills you're asking about, like what are the other bills that we can actually move? Okay, so if you're asking about other bills, one, we have a bill that would remove all contracts, budget contracts, like revenue generating contracts with ICE. That's one thing that we can do. Two, we think that there are a lot of things that we can do with our with the ability to, I'm talking about in the state, to allow for the city to actually bring more direct relief in cash to immigrants. And that's something we're going to probably need the state to give us authority to do in an emergency time, but that's legislation that needs to happen. Three, I think we need to build an Office of Immigrant Affairs, someone that's going to actually have a commissioner at the head. And this is something that Danny Drum is carrying right now, to bring more critical resources and separation from the mayor's office to be able to be accountable to the immigrant communities. I think that we can build a piece of legislation to support a language requirement that's actually fully funded. Right now, we have a local law 30 that is not being followed at all, but it's also because it's not being resourced. And with this immigrant a commissioner that is head of an agency, I think we can actually build a language bank that is the thing that you were all asking for so long, to ensure that everything is translated immediately as the mayor speaks, and sent to communities, and support our ethnic media to have what they need to be able to connect to communities. So this is all legislation connected to budget, and my time is up, but there's a lot more on the agenda.
Thank you for that, council member. Since we do have a couple of extra minutes left, we can go kind of like to the questions that went to overtime. So Lihia, I believe you earlier had an additional question for the council member. Would you like to speak up now?
Yeah, a very important question probably for all New Yorkers, which is, how do you plan to address the unemployment crisis that New Yorkers are facing, and not only create, I'm speaking about how New York, you're going to create jobs, but also raise workplace standards in many of these industries while revitalizing our local economy.
Yes. So one, I want to do that in deep co-governing leadership with you all. I think that because you're on the ground, you understand exactly the kind of protections, and I want to make sure that the city meets that. But here's where I know where I want to offer a vision. One is we need to make CUNY completely free and fully funded. So much of what I think can happen won't be able to happen unless the CUNY, the spirit and vision of CUNY is fully funded. And that allows for communities to be able to connect to education and training. What are we training them for? A Green New Deal. The city of New York can actually bring a massive amount of capital infusion to build our bike lanes, to build our infrastructure and resiliency, to build more schools, to do the things that we need to do in communities that have been divested from. And that would come at a percentage as debt service on our expense, which means that we have to defund the NYPD and remove the crazy contracts in the Department of Education that hire consultants to do who knows what. That can go into some of this work to fund nonprofits. And also the legal services have to be strong to ensure that if there are wage issues, we can address them. Also, there is a lot of talk about, and Liha, you're not stranger to this, to really bring the unions in and their worker centers to allow for non-union workers and immigrant workers to get trained. You are all looking for an OSHA standard center to be able to do trainings. You're limited in the space that you can actually do that work. Why not allow for the city of New York to build larger worker training program centers in the city, like at Brooklyn Army Terminal, in Sunset Park, to ensure that worker, and this is in every borough, we should be having these centers in every borough to train and have people working there and training there that can speak the language. And I'm talking about not just English, Spanish, I'm talking about indigenous languages as well, because many of the workers that are coming in are speaking, and we know this, indigenous languages. And that's something that the city needs to fund as well. But that's something that CUNY can bring in as well with their power and their ability, but if they're fully funded.
Okay.
Thank you for that, Councilmember. Hennessy's from the Laundry Worker Center has a question as well.
Sunset Park is here and strong. I love it.
Yeah, I wanted to ask again, like, I wanted to know if you, well, my Oma asked you before, if there is a plan, sorry, I had to step out. He asked about if there is a specific plan for healthcare, right? And he also asked about wage theft. And recently you mentioned about CUNY being free. And I wanted to know, well, you mentioned that we need a movement for that. And you mentioned about general strikes. And I think you're looking at the movement right here. All of these organizations are the movement. I don't think we need a new movement for that. Another thing, what is your specific plan to create revenue in order to fully fund NYCHA? What is your revenue plan in order to fund this universal healthcare system that we need so bad, especially for all these excluded workers and workers who are not included in the current system, right? So I wanted to know about specific plans that you may have for when you become a mayor.
Okay, so we'll start one and then kind of weave through the questions. Revenue, you're asking about revenue, and I've already kind of been talking about it in general forms. We need to tax the rich. Invest NY, New York is a great set of bills that are going to actually be able to bring down dollars. That's one. Two, defunding the NYPD at $3 billion. And then that's just where we begin, is going to help us release funding to do some of this work. And then you talked about healthcare, to bring more dollars into our city funded hospitals, to create an insurance program for everybody who does not have it in the city of New York. And we know that many of our workers and undocumented workers don't have access to a primary care physician. That can change if the city council and the mayor work together to fund that. And that could be something that we fund this summer in June. You asked funding, Claudia, if you wrote some of that, CUNY free is also part of this larger conversation about creating more revenue by taxing the rich and defunding the NYPD by $3 billion. What else was that? And I think what you may have spoken to earlier, Genesis, and maybe this wasn't you, but the laundry workers are sitting outside of protections that we need to change, and that's a law. We need to change the law in paid sick leave, and I think you mentioned that, and that's something that we can do, and that's something we don't have to wait until the next administration. And I will say about the movement, I know that I'm looking at the movement. I know that we can, if we can really connect the dots on all of the different pieces that we just spoke about today, that we can actually make that happen. And I'm talking about this budget, this year. I don't want to wait until I'm mayor. I want to make that happen now. And as a city council member, I have the power. I'm the only candidate that has power to make a decision on the floor of the city council to introduce and move legislation and vote on the budget. And I want to extend that power in co-governance with all of you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that, council member. I actually have one last question to close it off in the same vein of Hennessy's question. It's kind of a two-part question. In order to fund a lot of the relief for undocumented and mixed status families here in New York City, in many ways you would have to circumvent the federal government. And so my question for you is, number one, how would you as mayor plan to liaise with the federal government and our elected representatives in Washington to bring that relief to immigrant communities here in New York City? And number two, how would you use your power, if that's not possible, how would you use your powers as mayor to get that money? I'm thinking about, UI benefits for unemployed, undocumented workers or mixed families. I'm thinking about stimulus relief, which I know that earlier last year, a lot of the folks in the Zoom room advocated for at the city level. So can you tell us a little bit more how you would use your powers as mayor to fund these projects, and then we can close it out.
So I'm an organizer. That's what I know, and this is how you all know me. I want to organize the delegation in the city of New York, the Democrat, and if the Republican wants to join the congressional team, to put it on them. I think we need to put it on all of them, including our senators, our U.S. senators, to understand the agenda that we need, that we just spoke about today, and force them. They are in constant elections, and I think that we are seeing how the power of the voter is attacking anyone who is sitting on the sidelines on any one of these issues. And so I think it's organizing the congressional delegation, the senators. Chuck Schumer is now becoming more and more progressive every day. I think we need to confront him as well as the governor as we go to Washington. What I don't want to do is go to Washington and make an ask of New York City without having the power of the representatives here in the city. As an organizer, that's the first thing you don't do. And so that's how I would move through the city and the state to bring that relief, because the rest of the state knows that if the city of New York crumbles in any way, the rest of the state suffers. And so this is where we can actually do some work. And this is the work that I'm doing with Local Progress as part of their leadership team in the state of New York. And we talk a lot about that the upstate and downstate conversation is really one state, on how we can actually go to Washington for that support will impact the entire state. That's how I would approach it.
Thank you for that, council member. I think that about does it for tonight. We're out of time. It's 7 o'clock. So thank you all for joining us and hearing this conversation tonight. It sounds like definitely it's been a fruitful conversation, especially, hearing directly from all the wonderful organizations here this evening. Again, tonight we had the participation of the Union of Arab Women with Samia Al-Rumaim. We had the Ligia Guarpa from the Workers' Justice Project, Matab Khan and Anari Dola of the Muslim Democratic Club of New York, Carlin Cohen of the Chinese American Planning Council, Diana Moreno of the New Immigrant Community Empowerment or NICE, and Genesis Aquino and Mahoma Garfias from the Laundry Worker Center. And we also have the attendance of Councilmember Carlos Menchaca, who graciously answered questions during the second half of this panel, and Dianne Morales, another candidate for mayor. And I also want to acknowledge Scott Stringer, the city comptroller, another mayoral candidate who tuned in for the first half of tonight's event. So I'm going to pass it over to Sami Namir, one of the district leaders for North Brooklyn, who helped organize this event, and he can help us close it out. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Claudia. Thank you so much for all the groups that share the impact that COVID and the negligence of policies have had in their communities and our communities. Thank you, Claudia. Irizarry, for moderating in such a beautiful way and pack so many important issues in such a small amount of time. And thank you all of the mayoral candidates and candidates that came and listened to the community. So we wanted to have a forum that reverted the process where we as an elected officials and mayoral candidates listen to the most impacted and the vulnerable communities who are the essential workers, who are immigrants communities. So we should be listening more and talking less and doing more action. And I think that it was a very fruitful information and helpful and learnful experience. So thank you so much for sharing that experiences. And I hope that not only the mayoral candidates, but council candidates and the entire next administration can start implementing some of these demands for change in our community, for justice for workers, for immigrant communities who are the ones that bear the brunt and kept our city alive. And as Carlos Menchaca said, this could happen today. We don't have to wait for the next mayoral race administration to start doing this work. This could happen today at the New York City Council, at the State Assembly. So thank you so much for coming and listening from these groups. And I want to thank also of the other district leaders who helped organize this event, including Julio Peña III. I don't know if you want to say something.
Sorry, I was trying to unmute myself. Just thank you. I was managing some tech. Thank you everyone for participating and for sharing the organizations. Ditto what Sammy was saying. It was great to hear. And I'm going to turn it right back to Sammy because I know we have a lot of other folks who want to say something.
Christina.
Hi everybody. So thank you so much, first of all, to all of the organizations that are here. I think someone said it best in really pointing out that the issues and the injustices that we are seeing are not instances that popped up just because of the COVID pandemic, right? There have been longstanding issues with immigrant communities, immigrant workers not getting the justice and the protections that they deserve to get from our government. So I want to thank all of the groups who are here, fellow district leaders, Claudia, for doing such an amazing job moderating, and all the mayoral candidates who joined us. Thank you all.
Thank you, Christina. Jesse Pierce.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much to everyone who joined us. Claudia for keeping us on the straight and narrow and organizing a beautiful framework for this event. And of course, all the panelists, it's truly an honor to share space with you all and to better understand our immigrant and workers community, which is truly the backbone that we've been, as a community in New York, have been relying on. And so it's tremendous to hear from all of you and to learn from you. And I'm so happy that we could have this event and to know each other. And I just am really grateful for everyone who tuned in and really looking forward to what comes next when we work together. So thank you so much. Sorry, quick shout out to Emily Hoffman as well for helping us coordinate this event. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jesse Pierce, for your vision and putting this event together, as well, Emily Hoffman, for all your coordination and support. Emile Basile.
Hi, everyone. So I just want to say thank you to everyone helping organize this event. It was very informative and very fruitful information for us. And, it's just to clarify that immigrants built New York City, and New York City has been, relying on the impact that immigrants have made to our New York City economy. There's big talk with essential worker, and it's been a very strong topic. I'm sorry, framework for the pandemic, but we all know that immigrants have been essential workers way before the pandemic. And, it's very important for us to provide assurances for everyone, let them know that they all feel protected and there are programs in place that can protect our immigrants.
Shaquana, thank you. Shaquana Boykin.
Hi, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me through this mess. I just want to say thank you all for coming. I cannot stress with all of my colleagues have already said. This has been an amazing opportunity to share space, to have the opportunity to ask questions that relate to the issues that we all, have concerns about. So thank you all for showing up. And, we have to keep doing this. We have to keep policies and issues, together so we can actually get the change and the leadership that we deserve. So thank you for keeping us accountable, and let's hear more from the candidates. Have a good one, everyone.
I think that was all. If someone is here can scream. But to close out, thank you so much, everyone, for joining. And I think the message tonight was clear that we cannot call essential workers without giving them the essential protections that they need. That we can talk about protections for our communities without protections on healthcare. So we need to tax the rich and invest in our communities in terms of housing. We need unemployment and employment benefits, access to healthcare, education, multilingual services, and any of those resources and tools that our communities deserve. So these 5 groups that were here, they are the leaders in our communities. Elected officials represent them. So we need to listen to the communities and the leaders on the ground. And thank you so much. And we hope that we can continue these conversations moving forward.